2 Samuel chapter 6 is the story of the transfer of the Ark of the Covenant to the city of David from where it had rested for the past 70 years in the home of Abinadab. He was a Levite, probably a priest. He was located in Kiryat Yarim. Kiryat Yarim is also known as Baalah and Baal Judah. It was less than a day's journey northwest of Jerusalem. Now that David had selected and captured the stronghold of Zion that occupied a relatively small portion of the land known as Jerusalem, the place he intended as his capital, he turned his attention for a time to reinstituting and reviving the proper worship of the God of Israel, which had steadily declined since the death of Eli, Samuel's mentor, to the point of being something like an afterthought among the tribes. I've already pointed out that as we wind our way through the Samuel scroll, which has been divided into the two books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we find fewer and fewer instances of the words Torah, law, and Moses appearing in these ancient texts. And this is because we find less and less interest in following the true religion as given to God's people on Mount Sinai. Their preference was for a mixed brew instead of a Hebrew of Middle Eastern social customs, pagan worship practices, and then even some developing Hebrew traditions, all of which was accomplished in the name of Yehovah. Now it's obvious by what we've seen occurring in the earlier chapters, and now here in this chapter, that neither the authorized religious leadership of Israel, the Levites and the priests, not the civil leadership, David and his court, had any actual working knowledge of the Torah. But I suspect if we go back in time and we ask them if they did, they display surprised, probably offended looks on their faces. And they'd respond vehemently that not only did they know the Torah, but they were following the Torah and the commandments of God. Such is the nature of what happens in only a few generations after the Lord has declared his true and perfect word to mankind, and Christianity hasn't been immune to this same kind of a journey. And before we resume the story of the ark's arrival at Jerusalem, there's a question that needs to be asked. Why didn't David first bring the tabernacle to Jerusalem so that the ark could then be reunited with its God-ordained dwelling place? For this, we'll have to speculate to a degree, but I think the answer is fairly evident. The original tabernacle, a grand tent made of cloth and animal skins, had long ago worn out. We know that in Eli's day, when it was located in Shiloh, it had been revamped. It had been added onto. But Shiloh had been burned out, and the tabernacle likely destroyed. It's questionable whether whatever form it now held was even portable. But there was another and more thorny problem involved. There were at this time 2 high priests, 2 independent sets of priests. That's at the least. Each with its own loyal following divided along tribal lines. David was in the process of unifying these 12 tribes of Israel, and he had to find a politically palatable solution to determining which priesthood was going to preside. Each set of priesthoods had some sort of sanctuary and furnishings for it, some of which were undoubtedly originals, others replicas. David's solution was to not use the sanctuaries or the furnishings of either priesthood, at least not for now. So, with that, let's reread the bulk of 2 Samuel chapter 6. Turn your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 6. We're going to begin at verse 6, so that's on page 340 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. 340. 2 Samuel chapter 6, we're going to start at verse 6. When they arrived at Nahon's threshing floor, the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah put out his hand to steady the ark of God, but Adonai's anger blazed up against Uzzah, and God struck him down on the spot for his offense, so that he died there by the ark of God. Now it upset David that Adonai had broken out against Uzzah. That place has been called Peretz Uzzah, breaking out of Uzzah, ever since. David was frightened of Adonai that day, and he asked, "How can the ark of Adonai come to me?" So David would not bring the ark of Adonai into the city of David. Rather, David took it over to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of Adonai stayed in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and Adonai blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. And King David was told, "Adonai has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and everyone who belongs to him, thanks to the ark of God." So David went, and he joyously brought the ark of God up from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David. And when those bearing the ark of Adonai had gone only 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened sheep. Then David danced, and he spun around with abandon before Adonai, wearing a linen ritual vest. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of Adonai with shouting and the sound of a shofar. And as the ark of Adonai entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Shaul, watching from the window, saw King David leaping and spinning before Adonai, and she was filled with contempt for him. They brought the ark of Adonai in, put it in its place inside the tent that David had set up for it, and David offered burnt offerings, peace offerings before Adonai. And when David had finished offering the burnt offering and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of Adonai Sebaot. Then he distributed to all the people of Israel, to everyone there, both men and women, a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a raisin cake, after which all the people left for their homes. And when David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "Such honor the king of Israel earned for himself today, exposing himself before his servants' slave girls like some vulgar exhibitionist." David answered Michal, "In the presence of Adonai, who chose me over your father and over everyone in his family to make me chief over Adonai's people over Israel, I will celebrate in the presence of Adonai. I will make myself still more contemptible than that. I'll be humiliated in my own eyes. But those slave girls you mentioned will honor me." Michal, the daughter of Saul, remained childless until the day she died. We saw last week that at least 3 serious violations of the Torah law had been committed by David and his entourage as they journeyed with the ark to Jerusalem. First, they put the ark into an ox cart, instead of having it carried on the shoulders of Levites from the clan of Kohath. Second, one of the Levites accompanying the ark touched it when the oxen stumbled, causing the cart to lurch, and believing that the ark might tumble onto the ground, Uzzah just instinctively put out his hand to steady it. He died instantly for this infraction against God's holiness. And third, David and the 30,000 participants held a wrong attitude in their minds about the nature of this occasion. We find that they celebrated the return of the ark in a frivolous, party-like atmosphere, rather than with a more appropriate, solemn, and reverent mindset. But ultimately, it was Uzzah's startling death that unnerved David, causing him to postpone the completion of the ark's journey to Jerusalem. And in verse 8, we're told that Uzzah's death at God's hand made David upset The Hebrew word is chara. It means to be hot, it means to be angry. And as we've gotten to know David a little bit, I think a good word for this probably is frustrated. Despite what many women might think, men actually do have emotions, many of them. But although the array of inner emotions is substantial, the outward display of emotions, especially for warriors and strong leaders like David, is often simply reduced to anger. What exactly was David so hot under the collar about? It was that upon Uzzah's death, he knew he couldn't possibly risk bringing the ark into his personal compound, the city of David, as he had his heart so set upon doing, because the cause of God's fatal outburst was a total mystery to him. He just didn't understand it. Now, I said it in the opening part of the lesson that David had no working knowledge of the Torah, and here's yet another proof. If David knew the law, he would have instantly known why Uzzah died, because he touched the ark. And if the Levites had known the law, they could have explained to David why Uzzah died, and this didn't have to reoccur, and there didn't have to be any fear. But since ignorance was running rampant at the moment, an abundance of caution was the wisest course of action, it seemed. Well, this death occurred at a place that is described as Goren Nakon. That means the threshing floor of the stroke. And after the incident, the place was memorialized. It was given a formal name, Peretz Uzzah, meaning bursting out against Uzzah. And David decided that while he wouldn't send the ark back to Kiryat Yearim, he would put it in somebody else's charge for the time being. Although it doesn't say why he chose this course of action, the reason's pretty obvious. He's going to let somebody else be the guinea pig and see what happens to them. And verses 10 and 11 explain that the person in the family who would take the risk of housing the ark was Obed-Edom the Gittite, or probably the best pronunciation is Gathite. Quite a bit of strange commentary has been written about Obed-Edom, usually centering around his being a Gentile resident alien living in Israel. Therefore, David wasn't going to risk a Hebrew life should the Lord break out in wrath again, for whatever the reason was. But that isn't the case at all. If we merely look to the parallel account of this event that's recorded in 1 Chronicles 26, we find that not only was Obed-Edom a Hebrew, he was a Levite. It's true that Obed-Edom is not a typical or necessarily appropriate name for someone of Hebrew descent, but the reason could easily have been due to intermarriage. And the reason that we should translate Gitti or Gittite as Gathite is pretty self-evident. First, both the words are spelled identical in Hebrew. It's just a matter of how you vocalize it, the vowel sounds you add to it. But second, Gath-Rimmon was a Levitical city. It was located in Dan's former territory. We find that in Joshua 21:24. And as residents of Gath-Rimmon were called Gathites, that makes sense that that's what Obed-Edom was, a Gathite, member of the city of Gath-Rimmon. And as ignorant as David seemed to be to Torah protocols, he certainly would have known better than to intentionally turn the holiest object on earth over to a common foreigner for safekeeping, especially after considering what just happened to the native Uzzah. Now, it seems probable that this Levite, Obed-Edom, lived in greater Jerusalem, outside the walls of the city of David. Because later on we're going to see it was only a brief journey from his house into David's compound. After a period of 3 months, word came to David that not only had this Levite and his family not been harmed with the presence of the ark in their home, they'd been greatly blessed. What was the blessing that they received? Well, as we discover in 1 Chronicles 26, there is a list of 8 sons assigned to Obed-Edom's household. So likely this great fruitfulness of male children was regarded as a supernatural blessing that was due to the presence of the ark. That was enough for David. He wanted that blessing to fall on his household. I also suspect that during the 3 months, some Torah study was probably accomplished as well. Because in David's next attempt to bring the ark into the city of David, a lot of the earlier errors were corrected. Verse 12 explains that this time David joyously went to bring the ark home. The Hebrew word is simcha, and it speaks of an inner joy, a reverent kind of joy. Thus we have the context for what comes next. That David danced before the ark, wearing only a priest's ephod. In other words, when we picture this procession of all the musical instruments, the singing, the dancing, the attitude was much more appropriately pious. Even if we modern believers might have some personal inhibitions, some feelings about various kinds of outward displays of worship and praise, it's the intent and it's the attitude of the worshiper that matters to the Lord. Honestly, all the rest of it is just our own personal hang-ups. And we shouldn't run around judging others for it. Verse 13 explains that the ark was borne by people. That is, it was carried instead of being transported in a ox cart, like it was cargo. Further, that after going only 6 paces, David sacrificed an ox and a fattened sheep. Now, there's some differences of opinion about what is meant by this. Some say that after every 6 paces, another ox and another sheep were sacrificed. Therefore, however far the journey was, a pretty substantial number of oxen and sheep were sacrificed. And since many of these same folks advocate a goodly distance to Obed-Edom's house, it could easily have been thousands of animals involved. And since the passage seems to imply that it was David who presided over the sacrifice, then the procession took quite a while, because it would stop and wait for David to sacrifice, and then it would start again. Others say there was only one sacrifice, it happened after the first 6 paces, and it wasn't repeated. Now, my conclusion is that Obed-Edom's house was in Jerusalem. And so the distance would have been pretty short. Further, saying that David sacrificed is probably just a common way of speaking. In other words, all throughout the Bible we read how people brought their sacrifice and they sacrificed their animal. But in actuality, it was the priest who did the sacrificial procedure because only the priest could approach the altar. So it was probably not David who actually performed the sacrifice, but it was a sacrifice that he both provided and he ordered it to occur. I also think it highly unlikely that David would consider it a great thing to sacrifice a grand total of 1 ox and 1 sheep. So I have no doubt that the number of sacrifices was to be representative of every 6 steps that David took. And since the ark was in Jerusalem, it probably wasn't much more than 600 paces or so. So it's pretty easily imaginable that something on the order of 100 oxen and 100 sheep may have been sacrificed in the process. Even double that really isn't an enormous undertaking. And we're informed that David danced in ephod, and that there was shouting at the sound of the trumpet. Now, it was quite the spectacle. But just for the record, It was not a metal trumpet that was blown. It was a ram's horn. It was a shofar. And further, when we read of the shouts, which is a poor translation, really the word is teruah. And teruah is a specific kind of a shofar blast. Now, a shofar was used like a bugle. It was the means of communicating a signal from the leadership to the troops. The teruah was one of those signals, and it communicated the need for people to pay attention. So depending on the circumstance, it could be used as a victory signal. It could be used to signal that it was time to assemble to go into battle. Here in Seed of Abraham, we blow the shofar as a teruah. It's a call to assembly. It's a call to order. And as the ark of God made its way into the city of David, David's wife Michal was watching from a window. And what she observed sickened her. There was her husband, the king. He was whirling and twirling, and apparently in a way that to her thinking was quite immodest, if not downright embarrassing. But even more, to her mind, it just wasn't appropriate for a king to behave in this kind of a manner, especially so publicly. Now, the rabbis have noticed, quite rightly, that the scriptures don't refer to Michal as David's wife. Rather, she's called King Saul's daughter. Well, we're going to pick up that thought again momentarily. So the ark was placed inside the tent that David had prepared for it. And now there's a lot of argument about the nature of this tent that often stems around the English translation of tabernacle. Some commentators prefer to translate this verse as tabernacle instead of tent. And they say that this is proof that either the remnants or some facsimile of the wilderness tabernacle was previously brought to the city of David. This is what the ark was going to be placed in. The term tabernacle is used, for instance, in the King James Version and in some older European era produced versions, and it ought not to be there. That's a bad translation. The Hebrew word used is oel. Oel. It means tent. Oel is a generic term. It indicates a common tent that a shepherd might use. The word for tabernacle, in the sense of it being a holy place, is mishkan. That word's not present in this passage. We're going to get a little clearer sense about the structure and nature of this tent in the next chapter. But it's entirely clear this was not the tabernacle, or any tabernacle. This was not a mishkan. It was an oel. Now, next we're told that David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. Now, this sentence, when addressed in Hebrew, tells us a lot. First, the phrase, before the Lord, means before the place where the ark is present. Second, there were two distinctly different categories of sacrifices that were offered in this passage, the olah and the shlamim. The olah is essentially the highest sacrifice, and with this kind, all the meat is cut up, it's thrown onto the altar to be burned up to ashes. Nothing is left over. The idea is it's all given to God. The other kind of sacrifice mentioned is a shlamim, the so-called peace offering. For our purposes, the importance is that only some of the meat gets burned up on the altar. The bulk of it goes to the worshipers and to the Levites. Originally, no meat could be eaten that was not first part of the sacrifice. Later on, that command was relaxed. Thus, if a person wanted meat to eat, they certainly wouldn't offer an olah sacrifice, because in that kind, all the meat gets burned up. So Hebrew history shows that shlamim sacrifices were overwhelmingly offered more frequently than any other kind, because the person who offered it received most of the meat back, usually for a planned banquet. Now, this understanding of the sacrifices also helps us with the next verse, which says that next, to commemorate this day, David distributed food. He distributed a loaf of bread, raisin cake, and a portion of meat to every last Israelite in attendance. Now, there would have been thousands of people involved. Where would the meat have come from to give to all these folks, since meat was still a pretty precious commodity? It wasn't part of everybody's daily diet. From the shlamim sacrifices. In fact, there was no other liturgical reason for these peace offerings than to supply the meat for this happy feast to celebrate the arrival of the ark. Another interesting tidbit's unearthed when we look at the original Hebrew. The bread that was baked and given away in great quantity was unusual. Various translations say it was a ring of bread, some say it was a cake of bread, or even cake that was made in a pan. Depends on what version you use. The words are challah lechem, challah bread. This is the traditional bread used on Shabbat. Or as we have made it a seed of Abraham tradition, it's also served at all of our feast fellowships, except, of course, for Passover. It's a bread reserved, generally, for a festive occasion. And as the celebration was winding down, David went to his palace, or at least to the building that housed his harem, in order to offer a traditional blessing over his household. Immediately, an incensed Michal confronted him. In the most sarcastic tone, she verbally attacks David for what she sees as his unseemly behavior as the leader of the procession of the ark. She's particularly upset because he supposedly exposed himself, even to his servants' slave girls, as he danced in a priest's ephod. There's a number of things we can take from this section of chapter 6. First, there is some modern-day argument, as well as some rabbinical commentary, that says that David didn't really expose himself like that. Rather, it was that he was merely immodest, at least immodest for a king. Unfortunately, that interpretation doesn't hold any water, because the Hebrew word used to describe his immodesty is galah. And galah means to uncover nakedness. It's a term with built-in sexual overtones. And so to say his private parts became exposed at times during his dancing is utterly inescapable. That's what it's talking about. Second of all, when Michal said he exposed himself to the servants' slave girls, there are two things being communicated. Notice that these slave girls are said to belong to the servants. They were servants, so to speak. So these are the lowest class of people possible to serve in a palace. And the idea is not that these are the only people who saw David's nakedness. It's just that as bad as it is, that the tribal elders and leaders might have seen David like this, and that some of the common townspeople might have caught a little glimpse, nothing could be more demeaning than for a servant's slave girls to have had such a privilege that, after all, should only have been reserved for the eyes of David's wives. Third, Michal wasn't so concerned for David's modesty as she was for herself. She was humiliated because she was the daughter of a king. Notice, not the wife of a king, King David, but the daughter of a king, Saul. She more identified herself with her father, who was dead and gone for several years, than she did with her own husband. And biblically speaking, that is a spiritually wrong attitude and a breaking of the commandment for a married couple to leave their mothers and fathers and be joined together as one. But it also shows that Michal had retained that certain arrogance that most family members of a king have. One that we saw Saul especially exhibit at every turn. His daughter had learned from him well. And this compares to David's attitude, who as Israel's king, regardless of all of his other faults, did not seem to harbor that usual level of entitlement and better-than-thou attitude that royalty typically held. Fourth of all, Michal obviously resented being one member of a harem. She was David's first wife, given to him by King Saul. Not only that, but if we were to take the time to revisit the occasion when Michal was forcibly returned to David, there's no hint that Michal was happy for this reunion. The reality is that many of the girls that she resented for getting a view of David's anatomy, a view that she regarded as one that was for her alone, were the mothers of many of David's children. But she didn't accept her position as one among many. She saw herself as privileged and above it all. And all this whole dancing in the ephod episode reflected badly on her, as she saw it. Well, David didn't respond meekly to Michal's outburst. However, the exact meaning of what he said is yet another disputed part of this chapter. Now, I'm not going to go into the several interpretations for the sake of time. So here's how I see it. The first thing David does is to put Michal in her place by telling her that she's not the daughter of a king, but rather of a man who was deposed of his kingship by Jehovah. So let's get that straight. In fact, the Lord took Saul's kingship and gave it to David. Bottom line, whatever claim to royalty you think you have, Michal, is through me, who was chosen by God, not through your thoroughly disgraced father, who was abandoned by God. Further, David's goal in his dancing in that ephod was not to show off the people, but to show humility before Jehovah. Even if some of David's people, including Michal, saw his antics as contemptible, even if David himself felt contemptible by his own actions, those simple slave girls who have no such arrogance or position among men will honor him as king of Israel, and that's sufficient for him. See, here's the thing. David took off his royal garments, and he donned an ephod before the Lord. An ephod is the undergarment of a priest. It was an outward demonstration of David's inner being. A priest is first and foremost a servant to God. By David refusing to wear his kingly clothes to which he was entitled, and preferring instead the simplest of priestly garments, he showed that when the Lord is present, there's only one king that matters. There's only one king in that room. The Lord God is the supreme king of heaven and earth. And for a man to stand before him, even as a limited earthly king, is most inappropriate, especially for this occasion, recovering the ark, bringing it back to Jerusalem. So David presented himself as God's humble servant, and then in some ways compared his lowly position before God as approximately equal to the servant's slave girl's position before David. The comparison is, there's no comparison. God is supreme. God is unchallenged. And of course, it would be difficult from a prophetic perspective not to notice that David, as the precursor to Messiah, wore the mantle of a priest, however briefly, that overlaid his role as a king, just as Christ would. And even more, it mimicked the person of Melchizedek, that mysterious king and priest of Shalem, the very place where David had donned this ephod and was now ruling from. A lot of symbolism there. The last verse of this chapter explains that Michal remained childless until the day she died. There are a couple of important aspects to that statement. One is that being barren in the Bible is always seen as a curse from God. The Hebrew belief, and with good reason, since it's very much in line with biblical principle, is that a woman's primary duty in life is to renew life, bring new life into this world. A woman was created to bear children. That fulfills God's commandment to be fruitful and fill the earth. Thus, for a woman to not bear children was humiliating. And she bore great shame because it was seen as a divine curse, oftentimes for reasons she didn't even know. Now, whether you subscribe to this or you don't doesn't matter. The women in the Bible era certainly did. And that's at least part of the meaning of this verse. We see Michal's sinful and rebellious attitude against God and against his anointed one. And she pays the ultimate price for it, for women anyway, by having no children. However, there's another aspect to this. The Talmud says that the meaning is that Michal had no other children after this event. It says that she did indeed provide David with one child. And that conclusion comes from a statement in 2 Samuel 3:5. In 2 Samuel 3:5 it says, "And the sixth, Etriam, whose mother was Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David in Hebron." The ancient sages say that Eglah was Michal. And there is at least some possibility that it's true, because Eglah is not a name. Eglah is a Hebrew term of endearment. It means little heifer. You don't want that? Yeah, I didn't think so. But she wanted it. And while that may not be a title modern Western women would want, it was considered an affectionate thing in days gone by. Now I'm going to leave it up to you to decide if you'd like to adopt that nickname. Anyway, the evidence is too incomplete for me to come to any definite conclusion about this, but it has the ring of truth. Well, we're going to move on to chapter 7. But you can set your Bibles down because we're not going to read 2 Samuel chapter 7 until next week. But I want to say a couple things about it as preparation in hopes that you will read it thoroughly before we meet again. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is one of those where entire books have been written about just this chapter. No doubt it is the theological pinnacle of the entire Samuel scroll. So the academics that follow the literary criticism discipline of Bible exposition, which just might be the majority of modern Bible scholars, have major misgivings about it. There are many reasons in their repertoire of reasons to claim that this chapter is very nearly, if not an outright, fraud. Some say that this was a very late insertion that was done well after the Babylonian exile by a Deuteronomist. A Deuteronomist is a theoretical writer from ancient times who found various reasons to prove a point on a variety of theological positions, so he or they rewrote some of the ancient scriptures to their suiting or merely added or deleted entire sections. Now, to a Bible scholar of the literary criticism school of discipline, a Deuteronomist isn't a theory. It's a reality. Of course, the only proof that such a thing ever existed is among themselves. Now, how do literary critics decide when such a treatment of the Holy Scripture has occurred? By means of their own intellect. They just decide it. The literary critical scholar does not accept mystery. They don't accept miracle. They approach Bible texts no differently than any other ancient literature. They determine that there are things that an ancient biblical author could have known, and there are things that they could have not have known. So those must have been written by someone else at a later date after the fact. Or perhaps, to their way of thinking, there's just too many coincidences about things that work too neatly together. So somebody must have doctored it up, made it appear that way, or as they would say, harmonized the scriptures. Or they decide that a certain ancient writer wouldn't use a certain word or a certain writing style, and so they conclude that somebody else fiddled with the text. Proof? Their own opinion. But since they usually have a PhD in a title and often a chair at a very nice university, they're greatly admired in their field. What they say is taken as indisputable fact. I read a great deal of material formulated by Bible scholars who are of the literary critical ilk. I use some and discard most of them. Often, they have great insight, however, on the meaning of certain obscure Hebrew words, phrases, or they open a line of thought that no one else would dare to. And I'll tell you, sometimes it's quite fruitful. But if you could offer one general characterization of the literary critical method of Bible scholarship, it would be that it is completely soulless. As a general principle, literary critics do not see any spiritual element in the biblical texts. They do not believe in the divine hand. Therefore, what a prophet like Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel prophesies comes true decades, even centuries after it was supposedly uttered. It was all a trick. If what seems to be a prophetic oracle in a psalm eventually comes to pass, it was a fraud. It had to have been written after the fact. Because what actually happened was that after something important occurred, such as Babylon destroying Jerusalem, a later writer with an agenda, your infamous Deuteronomist, would go back and put words into a prophet's mouth. A prophet who lived long before the actual fulfillment, by altering the text to make it appear that there had been a valid prophecy and then later a real fulfillment. That's their view. In other words, there's no such thing as spirit. There's no such thing as miracle. There's no such thing as divine prophecy except as a category of literature. Of course, there are a handful of exceptions to the rule. My description of literary critical Bible scholars is apt. And as we delve into 2 Samuel chapter 7, starting next time, you're going to quickly understand why critical Bible scholars say that this chapter was inserted in its entirety after the Babylonian exile. Or it existed earlier but has been so extensively altered at a later date as to bear no truth to it. Or that it has been altered to a small degree but at very significant points so as to make it appear to be something that it's just not. And their line of thinking goes in this direction because if it is real and it's true, it is utterly breathtaking. and its impact. It proves the sovereignty of God. It proves the infallibility of Bible prophecy and the reality of God's plan of redemption through David's royal line. We're going to explore this amazingly deep, and I might add, unexpected chapter the next time.
Yeshua,